Welcome back to the Miseducation podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina DeKinney. Last week, we traveled back in history to learn about the Civil Rights era efforts to integrate New York City's segregated schools. And we featured a speech from Reverend Milton Galamison, the leader of the 1964 New York City school boycott. The week after Reverend Galamison gave that speech, an estimated 15,000 white parents marched to City Hall to protest the modest integration proposals that seemed to be gaining traction. The march was organized by a group called Parents and Taxpayers.
Well, we feel that we can prove as much as our opponents who use the same tactics. We feel that we have as much right as they. These are our civil rights and we're taking advantage of them.
The next day, Galamison was quoted in the New York Times saying, "Few would have believed we could see New Yorkers shamelessly parading for segregation." Of course, the protesting white parents were careful not to refer to the situation as segregation. They held signs that read, "Busing creates fussing," and chanted, "We've got troubles of our own, so why not keep us close to home?" Northern politicians and school officials and the Northern press also avoided calling their local schools segregated. Instead, they adopted the term racial imbalance. It appears in dozens of newspaper headlines from the era. New York City, Boston, Buffalo, Montclair, Mount Vernon, Newburgh, on, all dealing not with segregated schools, but with racially imbalanced schools. Racial imbalance even appears in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It wasn't in the original text. It came in an amendment from a Brooklyn congressman named Emanuel Seller, Section 401, Paragraph B. Desegregation shall not mean the assignment of students to public schools to overcome racial imbalance. A single sentence slipped in to exempt the Northern brand of segregation from any federal intervention. That's right. The answer to the question of why schools in New York and Detroit and Philadelphia and Milwaukee are more segregated today than schools in the South? A subtle manipulation of language. In this episode, The Persistence of New York City School Segregation, Part 2, we fast forward to the present day to take a look at what has changed and what hasn't in the fight for integration. Here to help us out is my good friend Asha Khan, Miseducation student reporter from, 2018?
Wow, yeah, I think so.
Man, Asha, I can't believe it's been that long.
I know, it's been a while. So, just to reintroduce myself, hi listeners, this is Asha. I was a high school student reporter for Miseducation way back in season 3. I'm now the marketing lead here at the Bell. Very happy to be back on the mic. So, back in December, we took some of our student reporters on a field trip to Queens Public Library in Jamaica, Queens.
This library is like a museum. It's like so nice. I didn't know libraries can look like this. It's like colorful, and all the entrances are like illuminated.
That's Edward Mui, one of our student reporters. We all walked together through this nice, newly renovated space to an auditorium with striking reddish-orange floors and about 120 chairs, half of them filled with parents, educators, and reporters like us. We take our seats in the empty front row.
1, 2.
Here we go.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Max from School Colors.
I'm Mark.
And I'm David Banks, School's Chancellor. Good to see everybody.
We are here for a live recording of School Colors, a podcast that digs deep, and I mean deep, into the history of New York City schools to inform present-day struggles. Season 2 reported on how a district-wide diversity plan in Queens imploded due to strong parent criticism. Sound familiar? On the stage, School Colors hosts Mark Winston Griffith and Max Friedman sit on opposite sides of New York City Schools Chancellor, David Banks. Here's Mark.
Okay. Well, thank you on behalf of all of us here on stage. Thank you for being here. The first one is a somewhat obvious question. Though, as everyone knows, the second season of School Colors was about the diversity planning process and how it fared in District 28. And just so you should know, I was actually on the diversity working group in District 16 in Brooklyn. And so I for the record, if you can tell everyone what is the status of not only the District 28 diversity plan, but really diversity planning in general throughout New York City.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here and happy to be invited to be here. This is also kind of my stomping grounds as well. I went to Hillcrest High School just a few blocks from here. The diversity plans in a couple of districts are really still works in progress. I would say it's just interesting as I have come into the space. The word that I have tried to suggest is that I believe that diversity is a great thing. I think that integration efforts are a great thing. And I stand prepared to support districts as they want to move forward with their integration plans. But you've not heard me promote that in a significant way, and there's a reason for that. And that reason is because I often think that our diversity efforts are a little bit miscast. I think the narrative that we talk about diversity in many ways is from an old model that represents a very different New York. My focus has really been about the quality schools that we need to have and getting away from the scarcity model. When my family moved from Brooklyn to Queens, we moved to District 29, solidly middle class, and the schools were not of the standard that they needed to be for many, many years. Why don't we create better quality schools in those neighborhoods? Why should so many kids have to leave their neighborhoods in search of a school, with respect to an integrated school model? Generally, when we integrate, we're talking about a handful of black and brown kids who get to go to a school with white kids, and we don't even talk about all the other black and brown kids that we've just left behind. Like, they're not even part of the story, right? And so the story becomes this smaller group of students who we created a path forward for them. But I'm really talking about, how do you develop excellent schools in the very neighborhoods that the kids live in? And there should not be this notion that you have to go someplace else to have a high quality school experience. That is what my focus has been. Now, that being said, other districts who are engaged in this process, I fully support it and will continue to support it. Any district that looks to do like what they did in District 15 in Brooklyn, to have a community-driven integration model, they'll get the full support of this chancellor.
Okay, well, let me follow up on that, because what you just said is a popular refrain throughout the series. That is, this idea that rather than having these disruptive integration plans, why don't you just make schools better for everybody, particularly on the South Side when we're talking in the context of District 28. And we know that the whole point of diversity plans is not necessarily just to mix kids up. It's really to try to raise the level, the quality of education. So with that said, if you don't do that, that is, if you're not in some way promoting integration diversity, how do you raise the level of all schools? Because it's a nice thing to say, but how do you make that happen? What's the special sauce, so to speak?
The special sauce, first of all, starts with leadership, right? You have to have people who sit at the helm who really give a damn, number one. And what I mean by that is, just because you sit in these seats of leadership doesn't mean that you care deeply enough. I'm a product of this school system. They didn't find me from somewhere out of town. I grew up here from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. I was a teacher, an AP, a principal, founded 2 different schools, and I'm convinced that when you have the right leadership in the schools, and when you have teachers who get the right kind of support and training, and you have the right superintendents in those districts, you can absolutely drive and have quality. But you have to be intentional about it. You have to know how to measure it. We're doing a whole host of things. I've only been here for 1 year, and it's a huge system, and I get it. But I didn't take this position to just play at being chancellor. I came here really to make a real difference.
I'd like to ask you a question about something that you said about integration and about the diversity plans. You said that the thinking about this relies on an outdated model, which is just about integrating black and white, and that's not what the city looks like anymore. And that's something we talk about a lot. It's part of the reason we were excited to do season 2 in Queens, is because that's something that we wanted to talk about. And Mark and I have talked to a lot of integration advocates, as well as people who are not necessarily about that. And we talked to a lot of people who were involved in diversity planning in District 28. And what we heard from everybody was that they understood that too, that the reason to put resources behind a process of diversity planning was to go out and talk to people and say, okay, so what does diversity mean to you? Because we all know that model is outdated. So given that, how do you, and I think if you listen to the show, but you also don't need to listen to the show, it's really hard to deny that in this city, the quality of education is tied in many cases and in many ways to race and family wealth and income. So all of that being the case, how do you expect that to change without going through an intentional process with some resources behind it to talk to people about what they need in their schools and what diversity means and could mean for them?
So there are a couple of things. One, I absolutely fully support any community effort at making those kinds of changes. Well, I did not want to ride in on a white horse as chancellor and say, I figured this out and I think I know what's best for everybody. And I want to actually make sure that I'm going to implement an integration plan for all of you because I know the value that it has. New York City is not only the largest district in the country, but it's the largest by far. And the breadth of opinion that you have across the city is so diverse. You come out here to a community out here in Jamaica, Queens, and some of the thinking is very different than you might see and hear in the South Bronx. And so I want communities to feel empowered to voice their own feelings around what they would like to see for their district.
It sort of goes on like this for most of the conversation. Max and Mark saying, but doesn't integration matter? And Banks saying, he thinks diversity is great, but that's not his top priority. I remember feeling frustrated because it was clear they weren't speaking the same language. When Banks says integration, he is imagining one model, but Mark and Max are operating from a more modern and nuanced understanding. The School Colors podcast actually does a great job of addressing the types of arguments Banks is making, so it felt like a lot of just trying to catch the chancellor up. After about 30 minutes, the chancellor left the stage, and Max and Mark were joined by journalist Rima Amin, a reporter for the education news outlet Chalkbeat New York. Here's some of their conversation.
Talk to me a little bit about maybe how, if at all, your ideas about parent power, parent engagement perhaps changed between season 1 and season 2.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest way in which one of the biggest ways in which I think the two seasons are in conversation with each other. Is that in season one, parent power and self-determination for school communities is really a running theme, and we're very enthusiastic about it, I guess you could say. And then in season 2, from the beginning, it's like parents, the story that we're telling is that parents come in to stop something, which wouldn't have necessarily been good, but seemed like it might have some possibility. And so what do you do with that? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I think that was behind the questions that we were going to the chancellor with. That is, this idea of listening to the community. I mean, first of all, that's such an amorphous idea, community. And I'm a community organizer, right? I preach community self-determination all the time. And what I was confronted with in District 28 in that conversation is realizing that a lot of people can be self-determining. A lot of people can get out there and be very effective at organizing. That doesn't make what you do righteous. And so how do you balance that out, right? How do you take voices that, again, are loud, that are effective at organizing, that have resources that others don't have, and that is a form of self-determination. And yet, what do you do with that if you feel like that self-determination is hurting other people and is detrimental to the health and well-being of other people around them?
Like, I don't think either of us is out here to be like, parents should be less empowered. Right. Right. That's not what we're here to do or say to anybody. But I mean, I guess this is just democracy.
Right. It's democracy.
And democracy is hard. And democracy is hard in a place with really, really deep inequality, over the course of generations.
So, in that same vein, you both do an extraordinary job of explaining the historic and systemic barriers to public housing and schooling and these policies that really worked to divide this community by race and class. Given that history, what is the best way to have a conversation about integration? What is the best way to build consensus and to, I don't know if this is the right word, but to start to overcome some of those deep-rooted historic issues?
I think you have to start with, as the chancellor was pointing to a certain extent, you have to be clear on what your goal is, right? Because I think that when Black people, as he said, say they're not that interested in integration, I think it's because of how you frame the question in the first place. I think if the question is framed as, how do we get a quality education? How do we ensure that every, for instance, Black child in South Jamaica gets a quality education? I think you open up the conversation, and I think diversity integration probably will factor in that somehow, right? Because if you talk about what it means to be a global citizen and what it's going to take for everyone to have access to the same kind of quality education, I don't think there are not many roads that don't lead through integration in some form or fashion. And so if that's where you begin, then you just have to be brave enough to be part of the conversation going all the way through. And integration is not the end goal. It is the means towards something. It's more means towards many different things. And so as long as it's posed as like that we're trying to, hold hands and live in a racial utopia, and that I have to be sitting next to a white body in order to get a good education, people are going to say, hell no, I don't want that. I just think we have to start with a different place in the conversation.
Right. We probably learned more about what doesn't work than what does. But I can't swear this for a fact, but I have a theory that the reason that diversity planning, as it was starting to happen 3 years ago, was called that. The reason they used the word diversity is because they didn't want to use the word integration. Because integration sounded scary. Integration sounded like what you were talking about. Integration sounded like Boston and all these other places where there have been huge backlashes. And so diversity sounded nicer. I actually, having talked to the people who are behind it, what they really wanted to talk about was inequality. And if they had said, what would have happened if they had said, we're going to have an inequality planning process? I have no idea.
People would have been against that too.
Yeah,
right?
I don't. Would that have been any better? I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know, but I think what some people wanted was to say, the schools are segregated and unequal. That's really too bad. I'm happy to talk about it, but take that off the table. Yeah. Take diversity and integration off the table. I'm happy to talk about how we can make the schools better, but we can't do that. Yeah. And that, I think, is not really fair.
Yeah, the problem is we've gotten to this place in this country now where I think we got to talking about diversity because it was less politically loaded than other terms. And yet it doesn't really matter. Like at the point you mention race and inequality in any kind of conversation, people are reacting to it. And people are reacting to it with not only a political agenda of their own, but what they're perceiving as a political agenda from you. And so, I don't have to tell anyone how, where we are in this country right now in terms of our inability to have the most basic conversations about inequality.
I definitely agree that there's fatigue after years of fighting for integration in the same broken and racist system. We've seen that white parents with more power can organize in a way that undermines parents with less power. Remember the counter-protests that Sabrina mentioned earlier? The ones in response to the February 3rd school boycott? Yeah, that's a perfect example. Though their numbers were much smaller, ultimately, white parents prevented the DOE from taking any real action to integrate schools. It's that pendulum effect we see throughout history. Every progressive movement has a counter-protest.
Well, this is a depressing note to end on.
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I had something more positive to give you, but it's kind of hard to be hopeful given these patterns we see over and over and over again throughout history.
Yeah, I feel that. Hard to find a silver lining in all of this. Well, here's what I'll say about that. We're going to keep giving students a platform to tell the truth about our schools. And we're going to keep shining a light on the issues as they are, and not as politicians or interest groups want to pretend like they are. And I guess we just have to believe and hope that something positive will come from this continued truth-telling. To see us out, here's Edward, who caught Mark Winston Griffith on the way out of the auditorium.
Hi, I'm Edward from the Miseducation podcast.
Oh, okay. We're big fans, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We loved your podcast. Anyways, we want to talk about integration. From my own personal experience, I know how important it was for me to go to a school that wasn't just white faces.
Right.
It wasn't just like sitting next to a white body. It was like talking to like people from different cultures I'd never experienced before. So how do we get that message so that like people understand that it's not just sitting next to a white person. It's not just sitting.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I think that all the things you described in terms of the advantages, that's not something that's going to show up on a test anymore, right? And so, how do you measure that? How do you speak about that? And I just feel like if you're going to talk about integration, you're going to talk about diversity. If you talk about improving schools, you've got to talk not just about academics and what it means to go to this school or that school. You have to talk about like making just more well-rounded human beings, people who, I mean, when we think about all the things that are going on in this world right now, in this country in particular, it's mostly from people who have lived very narrow experiences in terms of the politics. People who live in very narrow experiences and just are ignorant, right? Like, have not met you or me, and so their concept of who we are, God knows where they've gotten that. They've never had to actually be in conversation, be in relationship with us. Once you do that, it transforms your world. It transforms your politics. And that's what I think we need to, that's what we need to talk about. That if we're going to change this country, we're going to have to find a way to be in relationship with one another across class, race, and ethnic difference.
Thank you.
To hear the full conversation from that night in Queens, search for School Colors Podcast Season 2 and scroll down in the feed. While you're there, you should listen to the full season and Season 1 for that matter. It's really good. Special thanks to Max Friedman and Mark Winston Griffith, hosts of School Colors, and to Chalkbait New York, which organized the event. Do you have an idea for an issue you'd like us to cover in an upcoming episode? Let us know. You can DM us or email info@bellvoices.org. Miseducation is a production of The Bell. You can learn more about us at bellvoices.org and make sure to follow us at Miseducation Pod on social media. Our work is made possible in part by the Summerfield Foundation, the Pinkerton Foundation, and FJC. Today's episode was produced by the amazing Asha Khan and Taylor McGraw with help from Abi Levine. The interview you heard at the end there was conducted by Edward Moy. Music from Blue Dot Sessions and Lens Lewis. I'm your host, Sabrina Duquesne. Catch y'all next week.